Activate your core the right way, whether you're pregnant, postpartum, or neither. Welcome back to my channel, you guys. If you're new here, I'm Alessandra. I have a bachelor's in exercise science. I'm a pre and postnatal coach and fitness coach of the last decade, and we are talking all things core activation in this video. I feel like every time I do a Q&A on Instagram, core work, activation, deep core exercises, what are my favorite core exercises? These are all things that are asked on the regular. So I'm like, I need to just sit down and make like one big helpful video that will give you guys the answer to all your questions. Activate your core, engage your core, deep inner core workouts. You probably see these things floating all over social media. You've heard these words before, but what do they really mean? How do you know if you're activating your core the right way? Should it be different while you're pregnant or postpartum? I'm going to tell you what you should be focusing on when it comes to core activation. We're going to discuss a few different options that you have when it comes to breathing during lifting, bracing your core while you're lifting. We're going to talk a lot about pregnancy and postpartum in this video, but please know that this is not just for pregnant and postpartum women. Like, you should be activating your core, breathing properly, no matter if you're pregnant or not. They apply whether you're pregnant or not. And believe it or not, core activation does not change just because you're pregnant. The process still remains the same. The difference is it just looks a whole lot more prominent and sort of cool when you activate your core with a big pregnant belly. If you've been following along my journey, you've seen me do this and talk about this in some posts. I'll put a video on the screen here. You can clearly see the difference of when my core is relaxed versus when it's active. And you might not be able to see things as clearly if you're not pregnant. But to start, core activation is so important for all of us when we're exercising, when we're lifting specifically, to obviously activate those muscles and gain strength in our core region, but also to lift safely and effectively. When we are properly breathing and activating our core, we have better form, we're protecting our spine, we are just putting ourselves in a more optimal position to not get injured from lifting. But what does it really mean when I say activate your core, or if someone tells you to engage your core muscles? Back when I was training in person, something that I liked to do to kind of showcase this for my clients was I would literally like come up behind them and tickle them, or pretend like I was going to go tickle them. And that natural reaction that occurs when you go to brace, when someone is going to come up and tickle you, or if we're going to be a little more violent here, if someone were to punch you in the stomach, that natural brace is you activating your core muscles. So I find a lot of people tend to like overthink the idea of core activation, and they think it's either sucking in or bearing down, and it's neither of those things. We don't want to bear down in the sense that we do when we're like pooping or going to the bathroom. We also don't want to suck in, pull your stomach in and your rib cage is sticking out. We don't want to do that either. Neither of those is proper core activation. So knowing the difference there is important. But that natural reaction to being tickled or to someone punching you in the stomach is essentially you activating those core muscles. Now, how do you know if you're doing it correctly? And if you're not able to either A, work with a trainer, B, see a pelvic floor physical therapist, both of which can show you how to properly do this in person, what I want you to do is to sit down in a chair right now, wherever you are. Tall posture, sit nice and tall, as we're going to kind of walk through diaphragmatic breathing, or what I like to call 360 breathing more accurately, because it's not really just belly breathing. It's kind of breathing surrounding your whole core trunk, like all the way around, to get that full breath and then therefore that full activation. So we're going to do it together. So step number 1, sit down, sit tall, just relax your belly, breathe normally. Take a few normal deep breaths as you would. On your next inhale, I want you to think about your belly expanding, not just out in front of you, but as you inhale, that all that air going down into your belly and expanding out into the side. So like think about filling up the sides of your rib cage with air. And just hold that for a second. Just get used to that feeling of not only like as you inhale, it pushes your belly outward, but it also expands you out to the side. Like you want to try to be as big as possible all the way around from the air coming into your body. And then I want you to simply exhale through your mouth. And as you exhale through your mouth, I want you to make a s sound like a snake. So as you are making that sound, I want you to think about your belly essentially like zipping upward from your pubic bone all the way up to the top of your rib cage. And after you zip up, you want to think about a wrapping inward, kind of your rib cage or your obliques wrapping inward. So we're thinking up and we're thinking in as we're making that sound, almost like you're closing a corset or just trying to make everything come together without your belly being full of air, if that makes sense. Some cues here that might help you just mentally make this connection. If you're not pregnant, like I said, think about zipping up your core or exhaling and lifting everything up. If you are pregnant, I want you to think about giving your baby a hug as you exhale or lifting your baby from the bottom of your belly. Those are both two cues that have helped me, but essentially you should be able to see, especially if you're pregnant, everything coming upward and inward as you exhale. And that is true core activation. Those muscles are tight, they are active. If someone were to punch you, they feel firm. That's how you know you're doing it right. All right, next section we are getting into is how to breathe during exercise, during lifting specifically. We have 3 options here, and I think this is where people get caught up because they think it has to be one way or nothing at all. But we have 3 ways that we can do this, and which way you use sort of depends on your circumstance, your phase of life, what feels best. So we're going to walk through all of them. Number 1 is just simply breathing normal and not overthinking. And I know it sounds wrong almost, but if you're a beginner lifter, if you are returning to lifting postpartum, you have a lot of other things that you're thinking about when you're performing an exercise, like proper form, what muscles are working, how you're moving in space. You don't need to add another layer of how you should be breathing to that yet. Or this may simply just be how you breathe for some movements. For example, I'm not overly thinking about my breath work and my breathing when I'm doing like a bicep curl or a lateral raise. I'm activating my core. I'm at least taking one deep breath in the beginning to wrap everything inward. But then I'm exercising and I'm just breathing normally through that core activation. So that is another big misconception, is a lot of people think activating your core means you're therefore holding that breath through the whole movement, which is, we're going to get to that option. But core activation, you should be able to breathe through that activation as well. So number 1, free breathing. Don't overthink it. Just breathe normally with that active core. Option number 2 is exhaling upon the exertion of the lift. You're essentially breathing out through the hardest part. So if we're thinking about a squat, for example, the hardest part of a squat is standing back up from the bottom, right? That's when the weight is at its heaviest. You have to stand up fully. That's when most people fail that lift. So if we were to exhale during the exertion of a squat, we're bracing our core before we start our rep. We are then inhaling as we go down, and we are exhaling as we come up, and then repeating the process for however many reps you're doing. So essentially we're bracing our core, we're inhaling through the easier portion of the lift, exhaling through the harder portion of the lift. For a deadlift, for example, we are bracing our core, we are exhaling through the first portion of a deadlift, which is when you are pulling the weight up. And then once you get to the top, you should have fully exhaled, and you can inhale as you drop the weight back down to the floor and repeat. And option number 3 is what a lot of you know as the Valsalva maneuver, or holding your breath through the lift, or through the rep of the lift rather. This is the best strategy for if you are somebody who is lifting at a heavier weight, heavier percentages. Obviously heavier is relative. So I like to say if you're lifting above like 70-75% of your 1 rep max, if you know what that is, you're likely going to be performing the Valsalva maneuver, a breath hold, for that rep to lift that weight safely, effectively, protect your spine. That's just going to be the most beneficial. That's what you see a lot of CrossFit athletes doing, Olympic weightlifters, powerlifters, or if you simply just lift heavier. The reason why we do this breath hold for heavier lifts is because it increases your intra-abdominal pressure. That gives us the most tension while we're performing whatever movement we're performing with that added load. So again, it's going to help keep you safe and is a viable option for heavier lifting. Now, previously, back when I got my pre and postnatal cert, we thought the Valsalva maneuver was not safe for pregnancy. We just didn't have any data or research to really show that it was safe. Today, there is a lot more research being done. More women are lifting heavy throughout pregnancy. We are finally getting more studies in this area, which is super exciting. My friend, Dr. Christina Previtt, some of you may follow her. I'll put her Instagram here. She's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this. She's actually one of the lead researchers in this space right now. She came out with a paper at the end of 2022 titled Impact of Heavy Resistance Training on Pregnancy and Postpartum Health Outcomes. This paper looked at just under 700 individuals who trained with heavy weights throughout their pregnancy. Most of them are doing things like CrossFit and Olympic weightlifting, but essentially they were lifting heavy at least 80% of their 1 rep maxes, which is significant, while pregnant. Some performed the Valsalva maneuver. Some were doing some supine lifting, which is basically lifting on your back, which we know has been sort of myth busted as well. It's completely fine to lift and perform exercise on your back while pregnant, as long as you're not feeling things like dizziness or you're not lightheaded. But this paper concluded that these individuals had typical outcomes when it comes to pregnancy symptoms, so nothing excessive because they were lifting heavier, and pelvic floor health. Most maintained their pre-pregnancy training levels until delivery. Most participants reported no complications during pregnancy or delivery. Participants who maintained their pre-pregnancy training levels until delivery reported significantly less reproductive complications than those who ceased training prior to delivery. And lastly, most returned to weightlifting within 3 months following delivery. So really cool study that will hopefully open a lot of doors for more further research being done. But when it comes to pregnancy, you have to do what you're comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with performing the Valsalva maneuver while pregnant, you don't have to do it. You can refer to options 1 or 2. But if you're somebody who is continuing to lift heavy while pregnant and you feel comfortable holding your breath for a few seconds of each rep, it is fine. I will say personally, I have done this through the last 2 pregnancies, and it just has helped me maintain my overall strength and muscle mass that much more. So at the end of the day, do what makes you comfortable, but know that doing that is not going to harm you or your baby. All right, moving on to more pregnancy specific core content here for a second, because I know that's why a lot of you are here. The first thing I want to say is training your core during pregnancy is essential. It's not something that I think anybody should be skipping out on. Previously, we would say things like, you can train your core while pregnant, but you shouldn't do direct abdominal work. That's also not true anymore. The reason why I say it's essential, as we know, your body changes a lot during pregnancy, right? The last thing we want to do is go 10 months and then longer postpartum without even thinking about or focusing on our core, because it is going to make your experience both during pregnancy and postpartum that much harder to simply survive and just move your body and do your normal activities of daily living outside of even working out if you have a deconditioned core. Yes, during pregnancy, you think about all of the back pain and the aches and pains that we get just from carrying more weight. Our bodies are changing. If you continue to train your core throughout pregnancy, you're going to put yourself in a much better position to minimize those aches and pains, any injuries that you have. But also, your postpartum recovery is going to go that much smoother if you continue to train your core throughout pregnancy. So do not be afraid to train your core, number 1. I think it's also important to clarify, everyone's so hyped up about pelvic floor work while pregnant and symptoms. One of the best things you can do for your pelvic floor is to have a strong one. Your pelvic floor is essentially part of your core. So if you're not training your core while pregnant, you're also not training your pelvic floor, right? So I think it comes back around to just understanding what we're saying and what we're preaching when it comes to pregnancy exercise, both if you're somebody who's a professional or just a consumer. Your core is not just your 6-pack muscles, your abs. That is a part of your core. But the truth is, your core is a lot of other things too, including your obliques, the transverse abdominis or TVA, your pelvic floor muscles, as I said, multifidus, your erectors, part of your back. I think a lot of people don't realize your back is part of your core. And then some minor core muscles also include your lats, your glutes, and your traps. When you think about it, your whole trunk here is essentially your core. So yes, core work is very important, But with that, I want to shout from the rooftops and really highlight the idea that overall strength is important here. Overall muscle mass is important here if you want to have the best possible outcome with those aches and pains during pregnancy, with your recovery postpartum, with your pelvic floor health. Being as strong and capable and having as much muscle mass as you can pre-pregnancy, maintaining it if not gaining more throughout, and then rebuilding that postpartum is going to be the biggest key here. So yes, core work deserves its moment. It is important, but do not forget about the entire rest of your body when it comes to your strength and muscle mass too. And I will preach that until the cows come home. Hopefully to my home, because I really would love a Highland cow. And then last thing I want to touch on with just like core safe exercises and pregnancy safe exercises, we don't have a list of safe versus unsafe exercises in pregnancy. That is like a made up thing. I think that creates a lot of fear around exercise in pregnancy, with the exception of like blunt force trauma to your stomach, right? Like don't go out and become a boxer or start water skiing if you've never done it before while you're pregnant. Exercises specifically that you're doing in the gym, that the general population is doing, it's not that they're safe versus unsafe. You're just either ready for them from a fitness level perspective, or you're not quite ready for them from a fitness level perspective. And that goes for being pregnant or not. Like if I'm training, your average Joe walks into the gym and wants to work out with me, I'm not going to go have him do a 250-pound back squat if he's never done a barbell back squat before. We have to assess our readiness when it comes to specific exercise. It's not about safe versus unsafe. It's about your overall readiness and fitness level for that particular movement. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up here is that on Instagram, on social media, a lot of like the deep core or pregnancy safe, which we know is not a thing now, exercises that you see are shown from a supine position. So laying on the ground, lots of like very gentle Pilates type movements, which is fine and important. And that's a good starting place for a lot of people when it comes to core work. But I want to remind you that that deep core work really just begins with learning to brace properly, learning to breathe properly, and essentially every exercise you therefore then do can become a deep core exercise. Are we going to still perform core specific movements? Yes. Do they need to be on the ground, laying on your back or on your side? No. We still want to implement progressive overload when it comes to our core and that deep core work too. So that's okay if that's where you want to start, but that's also why I don't have like a list of like my favorite deep core movements, because it really does depend for each individual. And it's not as simple as these top 5 deep core movements are going to transform your core. Like that's just not how it works. So anyway, all right, moving on to coning and doming and diastasis recti. All 3 of those likely are words that you have heard influencers thrown around, oftentimes kind of making you scared to even see coning or doming, or if you have diastasis recti, you feel like you're just doomed for life. We don't need to fear any of these words, not here. And I want you to know that diastasis recti, first and foremost, occurs in 100% of pregnancies. Because if we think about it, diastasis recti is the separation of your abdomen, right? It's like when there's a gap between your abs. And it occurs during pregnancy as a natural response of our babies needing to grow. They need room to grow. Our core is not going to remain completely intact the entire pregnancy. Some people separate more than others, but all of us have at least some sort of separation at some point while we're pregnant. You can also have diastasis recti without ever being pregnant. So for starters, we don't need to fear diastasis recti is the point that I wanted to make here. It's obviously something that is more commonly worried about in the postpartum phase. So a few points I wanted to make regarding that. Number 1, don't expect your body to bounce back postpartum. We are not about the bounce back culture here. It's going to take time for that separation to close, for that gap to close. It may never fully close for some of you. Some of you it may fully close. That doesn't really matter as much as the overall function. So your ability to perform movements, whether you have a gap or not, is really what we're after here. And any pelvic floor physical therapist will tell you that. Like they may check for the gap and see how deep it is, but ultimately it comes down to function and your ability to activate that core properly and breathe properly through exercise without experiencing any dysregulated or just, any of that intra-abdominal pressure that is not regulated. And then with that, progressive overload is still important when it comes to our core postpartum, especially when we are trying to rebuild and heal. And that is why I created the Postpartum Forever program alongside Dr. Jen Morgan. She's a pelvic floor PT. So we created this 14-week plus program for the postpartum period. Whether you're 1 day postpartum or years postpartum, you can do this. It will just walk you through exactly how to rebuild your core, implement proper breathing and bracing, and get to the point where you can then perform more of like the heavier lifts and the more advanced stuff or whatever you were doing pre-pregnancy without symptoms, without that dysregulation. Know that that's always in the description of these videos. It's always in my bio. It's in our app. Check it out. It's what I used last postpartum. I plan to use it again this time too. All right, moving on to coning or doming. Coning is essentially unregulated intra-abdominal pressure. So coning, if you don't know what I'm saying when I talk about that, is when you are performing an exercise or not activating things properly, you're going to see a ridge, a bump, pressure, a bulging outward of your midline. It's more prominent in pregnancy and postpartum just because, again, we had that natural separation occur. You might notice it more. It might be harder to make that mind-muscle connection to activate your core. So remind yourself that that's a skill and it's super common, but you are not broken if you notice coning or doning happening. And there are things we can do to help mitigate it. Before I move on and tell you those things, I want you to know it's not a death sentence. And we actually don't have any research to show that coning or doming is going to make your diastasis worse or immediately give you issues if you're noticing it during pregnancy. It's not going to cause it postpartum or cause more issues postpartum. That research, it doesn't exist right now. So you don't need to fear it, but we do want to mitigate it when possible. So what can we do to help mitigate it? Number one, sometimes it simply just takes a cue or making that mind-muscle connection to breathe and activate properly while you're doing a specific movement that you notice it's happening in to make it not happen. So just sort of thinking about it more, if you will. If that does not work, that may be a sign that you need to then modify that exercise or regress that exercise. So, for example, pull-ups, very heavy load on your core. That's where a lot of people notice coning happening. What you then want to do is, if you're noticing this happening, you can't cue it, you can't think about it more and have it go away. You can then regress that movement, add some bands, do a modified pull-up. There are options there to regress it so you're still able to perform that exercise without the coning or doning happening, with a more controlled core. And then lastly, the last thing, if that's not helping and you're still noticing it happening, there's so many other exercises you have to choose from. You don't have to do pull-ups. We know there are so many other back, arm, core focused movements that you can swap it out for. So a swap of the exercise is the final step here until you can regain the strength to do the exercise you were trying to do. So TLDR, coning, doming, diastasis, not things we need to fear around here. And I want you guys to just be informed and have the tools needed to continue doing the things that you love to do. So I know this was a lot. This was a long video. It was a sit-down video. I hope it was helpful. Please let me know in the comments if it was. Also, let me know if you have any further questions in the comments. I'd be happy to help as much as I can, but I wanted to get this out for you to have as a resource to answer all of your pregnancy or non-pregnancy core questions. Links for the app or for coaching are in our bio if you find you need more assistance here, and I'll catch you in the next one.